what can we do? What's the best way, lessons learned, to try and create a new ecosystem? And we're going to discuss the roadmap. How are you going to, what are you going to be doing through the whole sequence? How are we going to make sure that the ecosystem actually works when you put it together? And what sort of central architecture? And if anything, that might be actually one of the key points. What sort of central architecture do you have at the bottom or in the middle, if you like, of your ecosystem? And what's the best way of doing connectivity? Remember, it's not about the participants. You can have thousands of participants in an ecosystem. Mexico does. They can't talk to each other. So, that's not really an ecosystem. That's a crowd. So joining the dots, connectivity, incentivizing. How do you make sure that everybody actually wants to take part in this? And then what happens ahead? How do you design an ecosystem that's capable of coping with the future? And then I've added a few extra slides if we happen to be there. I won't describe them because that'll probably take a bit of time, but you might find them interesting with a bit of luck. As I mentioned, I don't necessarily expect to be right. It's just because I want a conversation, and lots of things are called open banking and open finance. What does that actually mean? And are there perhaps some ecosystems that say they're open banking because it's all about connectivity, but don't actually adhere to the initial objectives of what was intended in the first place? Right, so a little exercise just to make sure there isn't tumbleweed going down and everybody's doing their checkouts. Check-ins, I should say, sorry. Shout out the countries with the most successful open finance ecosystems. There's not that many, so I'm hoping to get some responses here. So where have we got? What countries? Australia, yeah, that's a good one. Next. Go on, you don't need me to tell you these. Come on. Brazil, absolutely. Australia, Brazil, where else? There's a hint. Where's my accent? Let's go for the UK. So we got Australia, Brazil, UK, New Zealand, one might say as well. Doing quite nicely. We'll come back to that later on. If you think of any more ecosystems that are doing well at production, delivering, please give me a shout. But we'll come back to that list later. Okay, next slide then, if you could, please. Now, the roadmap. Everybody says open banking is about liberating services, enhancing competition, reducing costs, financial inclusion. Where is that in the roadmap? Okay, it might be in the legislation, but where is it stated that it's actually going to be achieved? Or is this perhaps just a means of creating a new framework on which actually just the same old people sit? Where we've got to do something to get the innovation in. And it just now pointed out that the innovation came from the small participants. If you create an ecosystem that doesn't have those small participants in it, you're stifling innovation and you're less likely to achieve what you want to do. So the roadmap, decide what you want to be doing and determine how you're going to measure the success. Now, I am being a bit of a purist here. Okay, I worked with the UK's open banking implementation entity. Were they able to measure how they did? Not actually very well, because they didn't really plan it in from the outset. So you can learn as much from an implementation entity from what they didn't do as what they did. So let's create a roadmap which has a future, and that future actually comes in quite important later on, and decide how you're going to measure success. After all, this stuff costs money. So governments are going to want to know how well your initiative is going. If you're not able to provide the management information to keep them advised, then life can get a little bit challenging. Basic principles. I put this in here, might seem a little bit disjointed, but open ecosystems only work successfully, first of all, when you have the trust. And when you have the ease of participation, I mentioned just now, if you're going to encourage innovation, you've got to bring everybody in. And that especially means the small fintechs, the microservices. Has anyone mentioned microcredit and so on? How are you going to get those into an open ecosystem if it's actually difficult to do or it's costly? They won't be able to do it. Even challenger banks are big enough themselves in the UK. They struggled to get into the OB ecosystem. It was only the big banks that actually had the capability in terms of finances and skills. By the time you got to the middle banks, they really struggled. So you've got to address that. So trust, ease, and cost. Trust not just by the users, by the way, but also by the fintechs and so on that decide to join, because they're going to invest a lot of effort. If they can't trust that this ecosystem is going to work properly for them, they're not going to be so keen on taking part. Okay, next slide, please. Right, I keep looking up there, and of course I keep forgetting it's down here. Okay, you need ecosystem coordination. I'm going to be fairly emphatic on this one. I am happy to be wrong, but let's contrast. I know it's an old contrast now and things are changing, but let's contrast both the UK and Europe. Regulations out around about the same time. In Europe, not coordinated, no central infrastructure. In the UK, that's exactly what was provided, and although imperfect, it was being done for the first time in the world after all, it succeeded. There's lessons there. Don't imagine that you're going to be able to build a country's ecosystem just by publishing APIs and letting the market get on with it. Maybe that's what's kind of being done in the USA. There's a bite in the backside on that one, on any ecosystem where you don't coordinate, and that's because it comes down to cost. It's expensive for organizations to integrate now within the European ecosystem because it's what I think of as lumpy. There's lots of disparities. You have to do a lot of work to get the connectivity in there. And that's because it wasn't centrally coordinated in the first place adequately. Next slide, please. So, central architecture. Okay, so we've got an organization now which coordinates centrally. And I'd emphasize the point just now, I mentioned about a crowd. Any number of participants doesn't make an ecosystem. What makes an ecosystem is the connectivity between the participants, and that is always new. That's why support and enablement is necessary. It's not the number of people in it, it's the connectivity and the ease of connectivity within them. And you usually have something in the middle that contains either a directory of valid participants, quite a few countries have this, say, yeah, this is a real bank, it's okay, they got a certificate so they can progress. Or, and it's a bit of a subtle difference, and I must admit sometimes I struggle, but a trust framework. Now, a trust framework is more comprehensive. And what that does is not just verify participants, it holds the details of the privileges that they have. What are they allowed to do? So it's more information, and sometimes this central component is accessed on every call, other times just every 15, 20 minutes, something like that. So they know what this participant is able to do. It's got their permissions in it as well. Now, I would argue with some confidence, I did say, I'm not guaranteeing to be right, that the directory, just like a telephone directory, you remember those, is good for a small ecosystem. By small, I should say relatively simple. Now, keep in mind, we don't want simple ecosystems long term. We want complicated ones with lots of industries in. Which model is going to be more scalable? That's an important thing. And my prediction is that quite a number of countries that haven't investigated the necessity for a trust framework I've gone simply for a directory and will at some point need to include a trust framework in order to continue scaling. And that's going to be quite disruptive. I must say, I don't know why this is necessarily the case. Perhaps it just goes hand in hand, because the experience in the UK is that you had central coordination and you had a trust framework. That worked. I don't know, I'm afraid. We'll have to continue exploring that one. Next slide, please. That's it, thank you. What's the best way of connecting? Now, I must say, I've been learning through the last few days. This is a proceeding exercise. I don't really know the best answer to this, but based on the UK experience, I'm a bit uncomfortable with the prevalence of central integrators within the ecosystem. Now, bear in mind, most ecosystems at least claim, and hopefully are, to be social initiatives based upon government requirements. So it's a social thing. So when you do a social thing, you want to cede control of your ecosystem to a commercial organization. I mean, that might actually be a simple way of doing it, and if you can negotiate well, fine. But is there a neater way of doing it? And I think there is. One of the ways that hasn't quite been done in any country yet is to have this central provisioning of connectivity components. Every bank, every fintech, 80% of the jobs they do to join that together is the same. Why does each bank have to do the same job as everyone else? Why not just create those common components once and centrally provide it to all the participants? Is that 5 minutes? Right, okay. Next slide. Incentivizing. Yeah, I think this combination, this is perhaps reasonably okay now. Stick to get things going, a mandate, but incentivize as well. We had big troubles with the incumbent banks. Most countries do. They don't want to do it. If you can show that you do actually have their interests at heart as well, you don't have to like them, but if you have, if you want their engagement, you're going to have to be prepared and able to negotiate with them. So stick and carrot. And the carrot comes from the long-term roadmap that I referred to earlier on. When they can see the opportunities that will come up beyond their traditional boundaries, then we'll be able to hopefully make some progress. Banks are difficult to change, though. They have a very steady culture. I'm sure you're all aware of the contrast in culture between fintechs and banks. You actually need to try and help the banks, support them in going through change management, for example. And I mentioned a few possibilities. I'll just leave it at that if you like. You're very welcome. And I think the slides are distributed subsequently anyway. So the key one, though, is I think this, which is what we're now beginning to get towards. The broader scope is where the opportunities really come. Because a bank could, I think I touched on it yesterday, but the opportunities really come when a bank is able to reinvent itself and put itself back in the value hierarchy by providing a wider variety of services, because they already have the trust in general. That might be a generational thing, but they have trust, they have confidence, an established brand. You can do a lot with that. And a bank that reinvents itself could be quite an attractive proposition. Okay, next slide then, thank you. Emphasizing the point. The broader scope creates the opportunities for all, build it in from the beginning. We have that luxury now. We didn't originally because we didn't really know where it was going to go. Now we can get some ideas informed from what's happened before. Okay, let's go back. Australia. That's a successful ecosystem. Guess what? Centrally coordinated, trust framework in the middle. Okay. UK, centrally coordinated, trust framework in the middle. Brazil, centrally coordinated, trust framework in the middle. That has got to be a lesson that's worth bearing in mind. Okay, next slide then, please. I did promise I wouldn't describe all this. This was a picture that I put, yeah, are you ready? This was a picture that I put together of a typical ecosystem. It's got the banks in it, the participants. It's normally animated, but you'd go to sleep by the time I did through all the animations. So you've got the banks, the participants, there's the trust framework, the support, that arrow towards the right is delivery of services, which is supported from idea through to production. And then you've got the coordination between all the different elements that you need to do, which of course is supported by management information. So you need to, well, sorry, I'm starting to describe it. Let's give that a miss. So one more slide then. I said 2 years. Well, no, I didn't quite actually, did I? I think it was written at the front. 20 minutes. Am I just in still? Just a tiny bit. 2 years. Ecosystem infrastructures have changed. It took the UK's OBIE about 18 months, I think, to build their trust framework. The same company can now create a trust framework in about 8 weeks. That's commoditized that component, which brings the opportunity to create an ecosystem at the very beginning of the whole process, before the regulations are there, which means you can then use that ecosystem as the basis of a common language for all participants. You can have the banks, the fintechs, the regulators, the government, and so on, all there, understanding the implications of what they're suggesting, creating new use cases, driving out the ecosystem, and having a common language where maybe, with a bit of luck for the first time, they actually understand each other adequately. Okay, I'll break it at that.